Fantastic. YouTube tells me that we're now live. So welcome everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm excited to welcome you all to what is now the third installment of the Historians of Catholic Mexico's book talk series. This is a new venture that we've launched this school year, and it's been met with a lot of success and enthusiasm. So we're really excited to have Dr. Margaret Chowining from UC Berkeley here today to discuss her new book with us. Right, I'll go ahead and introduce her in just a second, but I'd also like to introduce our two comentaristas, Dr. Eddie Wright Rios and Dr. Sofia Crespo Reyes. I'm also appreciative of them joining us as well. And again, feel free to participate in the Q&A, send us your questions either via the Zoom chat or also via social media. My colleague Nathan Elstrand is here. He's going to help me monitor social media and make sure that we get everyone's questions into the chat. But without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Dr. Chowining. So Margaret Chowining is the Muriel McKevitt Chair Professor of Latin American History at the University of California, Berkeley, where she has taught since 1992. She is the author of 3 books, Wealth and Power in Provincial Mexico, Michoacán, from the Late Colony to the Revolution, published in 1999 with Stanford Press, Rebellious Nuns, The Troubled History of a Mexican Convent, 1752 to 1863, published in 2006 with Oxford. And today's book, which we'll be discussing shortly, Catholic Women in Mexican Politics, 1750 to 1940, published with Princeton this year, 2023. She is now at work on a new project that is tentatively entitled The Liberal City in 19th Century Mexico. This book will examine the impacts of liberal policy and liberal culture on urban spaces and Catholic values. So thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Dr. Chowining, for being here. Go ahead, take it away. We're listening.
Thanks so much for inviting me. I don't think I realized that this was a new venture, but I'm very pleased to be a part of it. I thought I'd begin with the story of how this book came about. My first book, Wealth and Power in Provincial Mexico, tried to understand Mexican politics in the 19th century by looking not directly at politics, but rather at using social history techniques, elite circulation. That is, what happened to rich people after 1810. What strategies did they use to protect their status under conditions of insurgency, independence, political and economic instability. In other words, it was a social economic history of elites. I thought it suggested a new way of thinking about the emergence of liberalism in Mexico, and also somewhat unexpectedly, it provided some insights into the history of economic change in 19th century Mexico, which is not what I had set out to do. But in any event, my idea for my second book was to do something similar for conservatism, which I felt was even less well understood than liberalism and could stand for some fresh approaches. So I thought I would do another social history, this time of women and their relationship to the church. I'd seen a lot of elite women with special connections to priests in my dissertation research. Hadn't been able to do much with them to fit them into the argument of that book, but they kind of gnawed at me, and they gave me the idea that gendering the question of changes over time in Catholic conservatism could offer a new perspective on Mexican conservatives. Originally, I really thought when I said women in their relationship to the church, that the book would be about women in their relationship to priests. So in the early days of research, I collected a lot of now useless, to me at least, useless material on a lot of things, including the nature of priests' households. It soon became obvious that no pattern with any explanatory value was going to emerge from this line of research. But in the meantime, I had begun to find women not only in the obvious places where you would look for women in Mexican history, that is convents, but also in colonial and 19th century cofradías in what seemed to me to be sort of surprisingly large numbers. Like a lot of people, I think I thought of cofradías as dominated by men, and that was proving to be not the case. In any event, exploring women's relationship to the church through the lens of lay associations seemed increasingly promising. But first, I had done research in the boxes of material on convents, and I found the really cool stuff that led to the book that I didn't mean to write, which was Rebellious Nuns, as Ricardo said, published in 2006. That book has a chapter on the 19th century, which I'm really proud of, and which not a single person has ever commented on. But I still had a lot of material on 19th century nuns that I didn't use in the Rebellious Nuns book. So I thought I would use them in this book. I kept trying to shoehorn nuns into it for quite a lot of years. I wrote 3 full chapters that are now on my desktop and nowhere else. Before I finally abandoned that idea. Nuns were, of course, Catholic women, and I had a hard time letting go of the idea that they had to be in the book. But in the end, their story, after all, there weren't very many of them compared to these thousands of women in, hundreds of thousands of women in cofradías. Their story just wasn't as compelling as the story of the women who took charge of saving the church, as I think they saw it, at the local level by founding and leading new pious associations. So the book is about pious associations, lay associations, but over time I've leaned more and more into the political side of the story. That is not just considering the abstract political implications of women gaining more power within the church, though I do this too, but also the real world actions taken by Catholic women in the political arena. There was a limit to how far I could follow this line of questioning. But I decided to push the point that women had a significant direct impact on politics as far as I could. I guess by the time you were writing your 3rd book, you become less cautious. You've already got tenure, you've already been promoted, and you can afford to be cranky and cantankerous, as I think I probably am at moments in this book. I believe I have, or I found an answer to Jean Franco's puzzled observation many years ago that while, quote, women writers all over the continent, she mentions Gertrudis Gomez de Avellaneda in Cuba, Clorinda Mato de Turner in Peru, Harriet Beecher Stowe in the US, struggled, again, I'm quoting, struggled to find spaces for themselves within the debate on national formation. There are no parallels to these women in Mexico. Mexican women were slow to challenge the domestication of women and often fearful of taking a step into areas where their decency would be put into question. So it turns out, according to my research, she's right that liberal women in Mexico were comparatively silent and worried about how they would be perceived, worried about their decency maybe. But she misses an obvious explanation that Catholic women have been so unsilent. Since most of you have not read the book yet, it just came out in January, I think I'll, in the time I have left, try to summarize the major points that I'm making. As I said before, the book makes the argument that the changing relationship between women and the church in the 19th century had a direct connection to the changing relationship between Catholic women and Mexican politics. Since the literature did not, with the recent exception of Sylvia Arron's chapters on the Ladies of Charity in her recent book, the literature did not address either of those changing relationships, much less their connection. My research had to establish the contours of both, which it does in alternating chapters, beginning with chapter 3. Chapter 1 establishes a baseline of women's relationships to the church in the colonial cofradias, and chapter 2 deals with the regional and gendered impacts of insurgency and independence as a way of explaining why women first began to found new associations in the center west. So those are, I mean, there's sort of background chapters in a way, except that they're based on archival material. So the story, the argument of the book really begins with chapter 3. And from then on, the odd numbered chapters dive deeply into the explosive growth of lay associations led or dominated by women, and into the relationships between women and priests in the context of this increasing feminization of associational life within the church. Some of you might have read an article of mine that forms part of chapter 3. I published, I can't remember when, several years ago in the journal Past and Present, on the sort of astonishing origins and revolutionary implications of the foundation of the Vela Perpetua in San Miguel de Allende in 1839, and also considers the rapid spread of this new female-led association. This association was emblematic of the changing relationship between women and priests that I'm trying to get at. And I'm proud of the insights into how the new association functioned at the parish level that I was able to gain through reading correspondence between women and priests, and occasionally between women and bishops, between priests and bishops. Chapters 5 and 7, the other two odd numbered chapters, feature other new women-led or women-dominated associations, sort of chronologically organized, that cemented and expanded these new relationships that I see as beginning in the 1840s. All of these chapters are based on materials like membership lists, financial records, parish censuses, parish surveys, and especially on correspondence. And each of them ends with a discussion of the formation or the lack thereof of non-religious women's associations in the period covered in the chapter. In other words, they're Catholic associations, and then I try to talk a little bit about non-religious associations for point of sort of context and comparison. So the even-numbered chapters deal with more or less the same period as the preceding odd-numbered chapter. And these ones examine the importance of Catholic women's organized activity in the political arena through analysis of their participation in politics in the form of petition campaigns in chapters 4 and 6, and participation in politics a little more generally in chapter 8. And it also deals with the way their actions were received in the liberal and the conservative press. So the sources are totally different from the sources that undergirded the odd-numbered chapters. The hysterical, and I use that gendered word intentionally, reception of women entering politics by the liberal press is somewhat predictable, but it was very interesting to see the conservative press squirm as it tried to figure out whether women entering politics on their side was a good thing. And if it was a good thing, then how do you justify it? How do you write about it? Each of these chapters ends with an attempt to connect lay associations to the campaigns. This is what I meant earlier when I said direct relationship between the changing relationship to the church and the changing role of Catholic women in Mexican politics. Now, to be perfectly honest, there is less evidence of this connection, less direct evidence of this connection than I would like to see in a perfect world. Maybe Eddie and Sophia were about to point that out, so I've outed myself. Although I also do out myself in the book itself. I try to be transparent with readers about what I know and what I don't know. I do think there are reasons why women in lay associations rarely signed petitions or acted as members of those associations. I'm glad to entertain questions about that, but I think that there are explanations for why we don't see lay associations named in the petitions. And I also think that it's logical to see the associations as being able to mobilize political action before the period of the revolution, especially since we know that after the period of the revolution, they did so in the 1920s and 1930s from the excellent work of numerous colleagues, some of whom are here today. But I do admit that the proof is kind of circumstantial. Okay, an epilogue uses this same secondary work by my colleagues to connect the better known, because of their work, political and associational work of Mexican Catholic women in the 20th century to this fundamentally 19th century story that I've told. I already know of a couple of mistakes I made in the epilogue, so apologies to those of you whose work I either didn't do justice to or whose work I discovered too late to correct my mistakes. It's actually an epilogue / conclusion. And in the conclusion part, I try to crystallize what we learned from this book about the rhythms of Mexican history. Basically, that the reform was as important as the revolution. About women in Mexican history, basically that women, when you talk about women, you should include conservative women, and you should take into account that what Catholic women did affected non-Catholic or non-religious women. About the difference between studying Catholic history from a social history perspective, as I do here, and a church history perspective, and about not marginalizing religion as a driver of history, a point that's not new with my book, of course, and most recently in our field is argued forcefully by Pamela Vogel and Matthew Butler in their new books. Well, Matthew's isn't out yet. Pamela's just came out about the same time as mine. Okay, I've laid out, I guess, the big argument of the book, but to be honest, I think that a lot of its value is in the deep research, which allows for a fairly rich comparative look at Catholic associations, both in and outside the political arena, which we haven't had for the 19th century. And also in the mid-level interpretations that research allows me to make. I think mid-level interpretations are often the most enduring part of a book's contributions. They tend to be less kind of trendy and more sort of lasting in their impact. And in this book, I think there are a lot of them. Just a few examples. I weigh in on the timing and nature of the liberal versus Catholic ideal of the Ángel del Hogar, the angel of the home. I document female majorities in colonial cofradias and try to evaluate their importance. I view the financial collapse of cofradias through a regional lens in conversation with economic historians who are trying to understand the regional impact of the insurgency. I make small reinterpretations or comments on the importance of the Sociedad Católica, which I think I'm able to do because I can put it in the context of associations that came before and after, and also a small, more suggestive than really well documented, but reinterpretation of social Catholicism and so on. I think those are the ones that came into my mind this morning when I was pulling this this talk together. But I think that those are equally as important in their own way as the big argument that I've spent more time laying out. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Margaret. Fantastic. This was great. Absolutely loved hearing you talk about the book in this way. And now I have the pleasure of introducing our first comentarista, Dr. Edward Wright Rios, right, who is a cultural historian specializing in modern Mexico. He was a Guggenheim Fellow in 2018 and is currently researching and writing a book on pilgrimage in southern Mexico titled Devotion in Motion, Pilgrimage in Modern Mexico. His first book, Revolutions in Mexican Catholicism, Reform and Revelation in Oaxaca, 1887 to 1934, was published in Duke University Press in 2009 and won the 2010 Murdo J. MacLeod Prize of Latin American and Caribbean section of the Southern Historical Association. His second book scrutinizes the historical legacy of an apocryphal prophetess and her visions concerning Mexico's tumultuous history. Entitled Searching for La Madre Maitiana, Prophecy and Popular Culture in Modern Mexico, with New Mexico Press, published in 2014. This book offers a life and times of a legendary popular figure and narrative. Thank you, Eddie. Thank you for being here. Go right ahead.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. It's so nice to see all of you here. I wish we were all together and we could all go out afterwards to talk some more. So let me begin here. I really want to congratulate Margaret on this book. I think that you're too humble in your presentation right now. But I want to first thank Nathan and Ricardo for organizing this event and for, even more importantly, I think, creating this what we call it, organization, or could we call it a cofradia? I think this is a great addition to the field, and I think a really nice way for us to get to know each other, talk, and hopefully, I know you're doing this virtual side, we will also have in-person opportunities in the future. Okay, I also want to thank my colega, Doctora Sofia. Can't wait to hear from you. But mostly I want to thank Margaret for producing this thoughtful, generative, and inspiring work of scholarship. It's written, I think, with verve. It's brimming with an intellectual confidence born of deep experience and rumination. So we already kind of started talking about this, Margaret, where you were saying that it took too long, perhaps. And I think one of the great strengths of this book is that you've been thinking about and stewing on these topics for a while. It also reminds me of one of my mentors, now the late Paul Vanderwood. I feel like Paul rushed some of his books. Some of his books I felt had some great ideas, but he wanted them out so quickly, especially his last few books, that they weren't as strong as the ones that he stewed over. So I think the stewing is part of the great value of this book. Also, I want to say about your authorial voice in this book, it's not cranky at all. I actually think you really carry the confidence of a senior scholar at the top of her game. That you have gone through these things and you tell us, as you say on the page, look, There's not a lot of, I can't prove X or Y. However, I've looked at these patterns, I've read these documents, and it seems to me quite likely that this is what's happening. For example, that lay associations are pivotal in the production and circulation of, say, the gathering of signatures and the petitions. And to me, this is our job as historians. We collect all the evidence we can. We're as diligent as we can about what it says, analyze what it says, but then we also take that step. I think it's important for us to have the courage to step out on some of that, shall we say, thinner ice. And also have the courage in some future if somebody points out that we fell through, right? I think there are colleagues, people whose work that I value very much, but who I feel are too cautious. And hence their books can sometimes have less impact because they don't take that step. Okay, so I think this is attentive to archival evidence, but again, as I'm saying here, but willing to step beyond it. Margaret shares what she found during her research, but also she pauses and imparts what I almost call the feel for the undocumented that you see here. And I think this is especially important when we're talking about actors, for example, women in history. I think like a great conductor, by this I mean musical conductor, you use your ear for patterns, probabilities, and likelihoods related to women's actions and expression. More literally, you tell us at several junctures, this is what I expect women of the 1840s or the 1870s or the 1940s were thinking. I think that is the generative for new scholars as well. These are the jump-off points for the next generation of scholars. I also think this book had me thinking about how do each of us structure a history, a story, and a narrative. Of course, we all know of scholars who build on an event, right? They pick an event in time, and then there's a discussion of an analysis of causation, the nature of the event, outcomes and impacts. There are works that very well say they use a person, they follow a person and create what we might call a guide, an individual whose journey through the past leads us all and we see the past through them. I'm thinking of Robert Weiss's book For Christ and Country here, where Leon Toral is our guide through this world of militant Catholic men. And then I think there are also books like I think this one that follow institutions and the actors within them, or those that build them. And I think this, Margaret, is one of the places where I believe you're one of the accomplished masters of this approach, thinking very carefully about institutions, how they're built, how they run, this eye for patterns, and then the skill at making the connections. The telescoping between local, region, and national level, the integration of anecdotes and stories drawn from the evidence, and I think an enviable gift for synthesis. I've always appreciated this about your work. That article on the Vela was 2013, and I think you probably remember when that article came out, and as soon as I got a copy, I was writing you a message to say how helpful that article was for me to try to understand some of the things that I was seeing as I was trying to write the Matiana book. So I think this deep command also of the economic, I think this is something that has been in all of your work, and I think is so important. This book is not a follow the money book, so to say. However, I really appreciate the way your eye, or one of your eyes, shall we say, is always on that topic. Sort of how the economic stakes in a moment for an institution, for example, for the church, for a cofradia, for a new association, how the economic stakes of that moment, the financial shifts, drive choices, decisions, and insecurities. Or in this book also, how it opens the doors to deeper and broader action for women, greater autonomy, and leadership possibilities. I'm going to close here in my moment with sort of two questions, and I can't wait for our discussion. I think it's going to be quite fun. So here's like the big question. Maybe we can talk about this. I really appreciate that your book here, and you mentioned this, you say this strongly in the epilogue, that the revolution is not the parteaguas of this text. La reforma is the parteaguas. Now, this is something that I've been thinking about for a long time. If somebody comes up to us and asks us, what is the definitive book? I can read one book about the reform. You go, I think we all struggle, right? There isn't a book that just like, so I've long thought, and in fact, when I was producing the texts for promotion to full professor, one of the things I mentioned in there is I should write the definitive history of La Reforma, right? I think all of us sitting here realize how hard that would be. I've sometimes thought that it might really need a team to write that book because it has so many matices or facets. So a book that really captured what actually happens institutionally, economically, and culturally during the reform period, I really think is needed. So let's think about, maybe if we have time, if we center the history of La Reforma, what does that look like? And who can write that book? And then I think for sort of a fun, speculative question, maybe, I was intrigued by this discussion in the later chapters about this post-1930 and 1940 shift, where, correct me if I'm wrong, women seem to be moving beyond the Catholic Association, and we're not really sure why. And this was just reminding me of the mujeres católicas in my own family, who were all trained at religious institutions, went to school, private Catholic schools, and many of them moved into public education in Mexico. First in my grandmother's generation in the 1920s and 30s, one of my tia abuelas becoming a principal, and then in my mother's generation, my mother going to an escuela normal, and also one of my tias also becoming a school teacher in Mexico City. And ironically, though, my mother, who is 91 now, but didn't retire till she was 86, my mother continued to work in schools for her entire career, but worked in schools as part of her sort of what we would call Acción Católica mission. And here she was working in American public schools, but walking all over any kind of separation of church and state with her mostly Latino students. And just completely and without any compunction, inserting her Catholic Christian ideas into her engagement with students. But I think that 30s, 40s, 50s moment, I think there's something new and interesting to discuss there. And I'll stop and I'll pass the baton to Sofia. Or you're going to do an introduction, right, Ricardo?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for those wonderful comments, Eddie. I really appreciate those questions at the end as well. Well, now we'll switch over to Spanish because this is a bilingual network. And Sofia Crespo Reyes will present her comments, and I'll briefly introduce her as well. Sofía Crespo Reyes es profesora de carrera asociada C, adscrita a la licenciatura de Historia de la Facultad de Estudios Superiores Acatlán de la UNAM. Es doctora en Historia Moderna y Contemporánea por el Instituto de Investigaciones Dr. José María Luis Mora. Sus líneas de investigación giran en torno a la historiografía, la didáctica de la historia de género y urbana. En particular, ha investigado la construcción de un discurso materno en dos organizaciones, la Sociedad Mexicana de Eugenesia y la Unión de Damas Católicas Mexicanas. Es autora de artículos como La Unión de Damas Católicas Mexicanas, una organización de derecha en la Ciudad de México, 1912 al 30, al igual que su reciente libro Entre la filantropía y la práctica política, La Unión de Damas Católicas Mexicanas en la Ciudad de México, 1860 a 1932, al cual también le haremos una presentación del libro, ojalá este verano. Entonces, adelante, Sofi, cuando estés lista. Gracias.
Hola a todos. Antes de empezar, me gustaría agradecer la invitación de Ricardo y Nathan para la presentación de este libro y a Margaret también por compartir su libro conmigo para poder hacer esta presentación, este análisis. Yo coincido mucho con Edward. Yo creo que Margaret fue muy cautelosa ahorita en su presentación de su libro. Me parece que es un libro muy innovador, que hace un análisis de larga duración de la participación de las mujeres al interior de las organizaciones católicas, pero también en estos procesos en donde ellas van construyendo su propia voz política y pública, ya sea como administradoras de las organizaciones, pero también frente a los cambios que el liberalismo mexicano les va a traer a ellas mismas, ¿no? Y en este sentido creo que es un libro que nos permite abordar el tema de la participación pública de las mujeres de una manera maravillosa y sobre todo concentrada en un grupo social que pareciera no tener tanta relevancia, pero que, de acuerdo con el libro de Margaret y yo coincido, pues más bien fue un grupo que participó muchísimo, que actuó de muchísimas maneras, que construyó muchos espacios y que, pues sí, son difíciles de encontrar y de ubicar en las fuentes por su propia dinámica, pero creo que Margaret logra rescatarlas de una manera impresionante y muy valiosa. La obra que aquí se presenta busca explorar las conexiones entre la construcción de la postura política de la defensa de la Iglesia en estos procesos de secularización de las naciones y el papel que jugaron las mujeres católicas, quienes no solo administraron organizaciones, sino que también tuvieron actividades públicas que las llevaran a construir su propio espacio y su propia esfera política. Me gustaría resaltar dos elementos centrales. El análisis que hace la autora de la historia de múltiples organizaciones femeninas en varias partes del país, me parece que aquí ella hace una labor extraordinaria de buscar fuentes no solamente en la Ciudad de México, sino de diversas otras zonas del país, que nos permite observar las similitudes y las diferencias que las organizaciones de las mujeres van a adquirir, las relaciones que establecen con los párrocos locales, pero cómo hay problemas transversales que las van a atravesar a todas a partir de la construcción de estas dinámicas del liberalismo mexicano que llegarán a todos los rincones del país, y creo que Margaret hace una labor extraordinaria en rescatarlas. Y las diversas fuentes que utiliza, donde recupera un chorro de organizaciones. Aquellos que hemos trabajado en organizaciones católicas, creo que podemos ver que es muy difícil tener un seguimiento constante de ellas, porque muchas veces son fugaces, duran poco tiempo, y Margaret hace una labor extraordinaria no solo de quedarse con las grandes, sino de ir buscando como de estas organizaciones más pequeñas que luego han sido ignoradas por la historiografía, por las propias características de las fuentes, creo yo. Ella logra rescatarlas, y si bien, como ella dijo en su presentación, nos menciona las dificultades que ella se enfrenta al momento de analizarlas, creo que lo hace de una manera muy lograda. Yo, para no hablarles de la organización del texto en su totalidad, porque es una obra vasta, me gustaría. Es una obra que se divide en 8 capítulos, en 3 grandes partes, donde va dividiendo pues, el periodo novohispano, el periodo de la Reforma principalmente, y luego el periodo del porfiriato y la posrevolución, con lo que ella cierra como parte de su epílogo. Pero para mí esta obra está atravesada por una serie de ejes que creo que son los que a mí me gustaría rescatar, ¿no? El primero de ellos es la Agencia de las Mujeres Católicas. Creo que a lo largo del texto ella hace un trabajo importante por ir encontrando las maneras en las que la propia relación de la Iglesia con las mujeres y de las mujeres con la Iglesia va transformando la actividad de ellas y su relación con los sacerdotes locales, así como la manera en la que ellas van adquiriendo sus propias posturas. El trabajo me parece que documenta de una manera impresionante la diversidad de organizaciones que existen, pero también estas dinámicas internas de la relación sacerdote-mujeres que le permite a Margaret ir rescatando la agencia de las mujeres. Un tema que a la historiografía nos ha costado mucho trabajo recuperar y rescatar y nombrar como tal, creo yo, porque efectivamente las fuentes son difíciles de acceder y son dinámicas que me parecía a mí no del todo claras de rescatar, pues, ¿no? O sea, voy a tratar de explicarlo un poquito mejor. La construcción de esta agencia femenina en la participación de las organizaciones católicas nos obliga a ver, creo yo, que el trabajo o acercarnos a la historia de género de las mujeres nos obliga a observar que hay dinámicas de la propia construcción de la historiografía y de la forma de hacer historia que, 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 que ha estado, o sea, que está tan señalada o tan marcada por análisis políticos, que cuando uno analiza la agencia femenina, uno tiene que tomar en cuenta la forma en la que las mujeres actúan dentro de sus propios espacios privados y dentro de las dinámicas de lo sutil, pues, ¿no? Y creo que el libro de Margaret hace una labor muy importante en rescatar cómo sutilmente las mujeres van no solamente construyendo sus organizaciones, sino construyendo una labor constante de trabajo que van a ir recuperando poco a poco y que si bien igual en las fuentes nos hablan de detalles muy marcaditos, como ella lo hace con la vela perpetua, ¿no? De cómo ellas, las mujeres se encargan de estar todo el tiempo en la iglesia y de mantenerla limpia y de mantenerla arreglada, pues en el fondo son labores tan sutiles, pero tan constantes, que nos hablan de la manera de ser y de actuar desde estos espacios privados y desde el espacio de cuidado femenino, que solo una mirada igual muy sutil y muy femenina nos puede permitir observar, creo yo, ¿no? Y que creo que historiográficamente es bien difícil de rescatar porque pues estamos acostumbrados a construir una historiografía y una historia basada en metodologías que apuntan hacia lo político desde otra mirada, pues, ¿no? Y creo que desde aquí tu trabajo, desde la primera vez que leí el texto de La Vela Perpetua y ahora me recordó también que leí tu trabajo de ese texto, y mi propio trabajo me recuerdan eso, o sea, me recuerdan que recuperar este tipo de información es bien complicado porque nos habla de una serie de experiencias que dejan pocas fuentes y que las fuentes que dejan registros tan sutiles que no nos queda de otra más que hacerlo de una manera también un poco ambigua, pero que creo que tú lo haces muy bien y lo rescatas de una manera maravillosa porque al final nos permites observar a partir de todos estos ejemplos que nos vas dando a lo largo del país, que pues efectivamente ellas logran ir incursionando en el espacio político, tanto en su relación con los sacerdotes como en las crisis que van a tener con los otros, pues con las otras voces con las que van a terminar discutiendo ya en la arena pública, una serie de relaciones políticas bien importantes, ¿no? De las cuales ellas también van a ir, pues, construyendo su propia voz para defender los espacios que ellas conciben como sus espacios, ¿no? Que serán igual espacios femeninos, espacios del cuidado, espacios enfocados a lo doméstico, pero pues que al final construyen redes, ¿no? Y creo que tu texto eso rescata una serie de herencias enfocadas en la construcción de redes femeninas que permiten a las mujeres pues sobrevivir en diversos espacios y en diversos ambientes. Y en ese sentido me parece a mí muy valioso. Y creo que viene mucho de esta construcción de la agencia femenina que tú rescatas, ¿no? Como elemento número uno. El segundo elemento me parece que es la construcción de un discurso político enfocado justamente en esta relación que ellas van a ir estableciendo con su propia postura del papel de la mujer y de cómo ellas, pese a sus actividades, también se enfocan en recuperar y en señalar sus espacios de acción como unos espacios femeninos. Y el último elemento es esta doble dinámica de su relación y su resistencia, y de esta como resistencia constante al reconocimiento del trabajo femenino, tanto de una postura política propia de la Iglesia Católica como de estas agrupaciones del discurso político liberal que tú rescatas a través de la prensa, ¿no? Que tiene como esta doble función. Por un lado, se sirven como para no darles este liderazgo público que ellas pues tenían en su acción constante, y por el otro lado sirve también para minimizar y para actuar como una especie de burla frente a la propia relación que establece la Iglesia con el movimiento liberal del siglo XIX. Y creo que tú ahí también haces como una labor bien importante en ir rescatando cómo pues las mujeres y sus actividades van a estar en el centro de una discusión que, si bien pareciera que no tiene que ver con ellas, ellas están ahí metidas y trabajando en todos los espacios, ¿no? Entonces creo que tu texto en este sentido es muy novedoso, porque nos ayuda mucho a observar cómo las dinámicas de las relaciones de género se van a dar en torno a la actividad de ellas, pero también en torno a su voz pública y a los discursos donde la participación y el proceso de feminización de la iglesia que tú mencionas constantemente en tu libro se vuelve al mismo tiempo un doble juego, tanto para la iglesia como para los movimientos liberales, y eso me parece sumamente importante de rescatar, y sobre todo porque creo que son elementos que luego yo logré ver más adelante en la historia de tus sierras, que comienzo yo, ya hacia el periodo de la Guerra Cristera, ¿no? Entonces, pues yo con eso me quedo, sobre todo de tu trabajo, me parece un trabajo muy interesante, muy brillante. No puedo decir que tengo preguntas como tal, porque más bien tengo muchas felicitaciones, y y pues eso, más bien yo agradezco mucho la posibilidad de haber leído tu libro, de haber encontrado que estas formas femeninas de organización, que yo me vine a encontrar con ellas en los años del siglo XX, pues tú te las encuentras en el siglo XIX cuando nos hablas de las mujeres juntando firmas para el Segundo Imperio, bueno, el periodo del Segundo Imperio, y cómo se organizan y cómo van caminando de casa en casa buscando firmas y hablando entre mujeres y relacionándose entre ellas, discutiendo en espacios y construyendo redes. Yo me las encuentro 40, 50 años después actuando de una manera muy similar, ¿no? Entonces me deja a mí esta sensación de tu libro, que es un análisis de larga duración de un proceso de organización femenina que pues probablemente continúe si nos metemos también a las organizaciones que existen hoy en día de mujeres católicas. Y yo con esto cerraría para poder dejar la palabra al resto de los invitados y agradecer una vez más la invitación a estar aquí con ustedes platicando.
Muy bien, muchas gracias, Sofía, por esos comentarios y felicitaciones. Margaret, I know that Eddie had those questions for you. We could start the conversation if you want to answer them. If you also want to respond to some of Sophia's comments, you're more than welcome to do that as well. And we obviously invite everybody who's in the audience now, if you have questions for Dr. Chowining, if you'd like to either put them in the chat, raise your hand. If you're on social media, you can write them through there and Nathan will get to them as well. I'll let Margaret respond now, but then we'd love to open it up for Q&A from the audience. So you're all more than welcome to go ahead and jump in whenever you'd like. Thank you.
Okay, just a couple of things. First of all, thanks to both of you, Eddie and Sophia. Such really warm comments. Thank you very much. Eddie, I think I wrote for you for your full professor promotion. And I think I said, yeah, his monographs are pretty good, but that book that he says he's going to write on the reform, that's why you should promote him. I love your work. Let's see. I think maybe I just want to, when Sophia was talking about the sources that I was able to use to sort of rescue women from obscurity, it occurred to me that that all of you might enjoy a story about how this book, and I think Sophia also pointed out that it's based on research in a number of different archiepiscopal archives. Some of you might appreciate the reason for that. When I started out this project, I know this is going to make me sound very naive or unthinking, but I just sort of thought that the relationship between women and the church would be one of those things that didn't really have that much of a regional pattern, that it would be that I could write a national study based on work in a couple of archives and it would apply everywhere. I now know I now know that's very, very far from the truth, not just from my own experience, but my own experience was pretty entertaining. So I found this bundle of letters about the initial foundation of the Vela Perpetua in San Miguel de Allende. And first of all, I kind of couldn't believe when it said this association can only have female officers. I looked at the word señoras, and I looked at it, and I looked at it some more, and I thought, are they really saying señoras instead of señores? So I kept reading, and it was pretty exciting, since I was looking for women in the church, to find them in this kind of extraordinary way. And then I found a lot more mentions of the Vela Perpetua. I went the next summer to Guadalajara, and I continued to find evidence of the spread of the Vela Perpetua. So by this time, I'm thinking, okay, this is just everywhere in Mexico. And luckily, I had planned a trip to Mexico City anyway, for reasons I'm not going to go into what I was hoping to find, but what I didn't find was anything about the Vela Perpetua in Mexico City, where I assumed if it was big in, Pátzcuaro, that it would be enormous in Mexico City. Nothing. And then I thought, oh my gosh, I've got to go. Maybe there's something about Mexico City cofradias, that the old cofradias are just squeezing out any new ones. I better go some other places. So I went to Oaxaca, and I found some interesting material in Oaxaca, but really nothing on the Vela Perpetua. And I went then not to Durango, but to Las Cruces, New Mexico, where the New Mexico State University, as some of you may know, has microfilmed every scrap of paper in the Archbishopric of Durango, and the notary archives too, I think, or the state archive of Durango. In any event, I was in Las Cruces in a summer where the temperature averaged like 110 degrees, and no Vela Perpetua there either. So then I had to, it's like one of those cases that historians find where the facts don't line, what you have found in the archive doesn't line up with what you think that you were going to find, and you have to come up with a new interpretation. You have to recalibrate the entire project. So I'm satisfied with how I did it, but it was a kind of totally accidental decision to visit all of those archives, Sophia, that you praise me for visiting. And I also want to just shout out to you, Sophia, for the use. Sometimes it's a small thing that really gets your brain moving and in different directions, but your own use of the word redes with regard to women, that was super important for me. I went back and kind of looked for this sort of thing throughout the manuscript after I saw how useful a concept it was for you. So I guess this is just, I'll circle back to Eddie's first comment about how it's good to have things take a long time and to let things stew, because you read people's dissertations and hear things that make you, and go to different archives that change the book for the better. Okay, I think I'll stop there. That should give us some time for questions. I don't have the chat up. Let me see.
Puedo, en lo que el resto se anima. Yo,
sí, adelante.
la idea de las redes me surgió de tu artículo de la vela perpetua.
Well,
Y justamente
it all fits together.
aquí cerramos un círculo.
Yeah, ¿verdad?
Porque justo estaba yo leyendo tu artículo, no sé, pues cuando estaba haciendo el doctorado, digo, bueno, es que esta mujer tiene toda la razón. O sea, las mujeres católicas están construyendo una relación
Yeah.
bien diferente con
Yeah.
los sacerdotes, con la iglesia y también entre ellas, ¿no? Y pues justo mi trabajo me permitió, digamos, ampliarme para allá, pero pues eso, si no hubiera sido por trabajo, quién sabe si yo lo hubiera logrado, ¿no?
Okay.
So we have a comment from Eddie on the chat. Eddie, if you'd like to say anything, we don't see any hands up yet, so you're more than welcome to jump in. You're muted. Go ahead.
Wow, that's like early pandemic, right? Where you start talking. Okay. Wake up. Okay. I was just, as you were talking, I was just thinking about one of the things in this book, the regional research that you do, I think really surfaces powerfully how things like the wars of independence and what they do to cofradías and just the general economy of Jalisco and Michoacán set the stage for institutional innovation later. And I just found that very convincing, that this kind of like people looking at the ashes of their cofradías and of their churches and of their towns would be like, how do we do this? And if we have to open this up to a new way of doing things, let's do it.
Yeah. I mean, for me, that was one of the most fun parts of developing an interpretation, was trying to understand why you don't see the Vela Perpetua in some of these other places, where there was also damage to cofradías. But just for those who, since nobody's read the book yet, or not, I doubt any of you have read it yet. The argument that I make is that it kind of swings on the willingness of male leaders of cofradías to continue to serve in the traditional cofradías. And if this happens, if they perceive that there's still value to them for their leadership of the cofradía, then you don't create the space for new innovations like happened in Michoacán and Jalisco. In Michoacán and Jalisco, the male leaders of these cofradías were fleeing the sinking ships. It always was expensive to be a leader of a cofradía. In the colonial period, you a lot of times had to pay for a procession or a celebration or the candles or the wax or something out of your own pocket if need be. But that became unsustainable in those places, and all of the benefits of cofradía leadership kind of go away, and just place after place you see these the cofradías being taken over by the priest, because there's no male, he can't find any men who are willing to be the leaders, and that doesn't seem to happen. There seems to be a recovery and a kind of a recreation of the traditional cofradía in the other parts of Mexico that were not, I surmise, not as much damaged during the insurgency. So yeah, that was really fun, and I thank you for liking that too.
We have a question on the chat, Margaret. I'll read it for you, and Natalie, you'll go next. So Teresita Lozano says, "Thank you so much for your work. I look forward to reading it. I wanted to know if your book interrogates the role of class and ethnicity in women's religio-political involvement, especially in the years approaching the Mexican Revolution and the Cristero Rebellion. Did whiteness, indigeneity, mestizaje play a significant role in women's activism, public perception, and position in the church?"
Yeah, thanks for that question. First of all, I should clarify that despite the dates in the title, I did not do archival research. Did a little bit in Jalisco, but I really didn't do archival research after 1912, after the foundation of the Damas Católicas. So I don't have what I say in that epilogue is dependent on what other people have said much better. The role of class and ethnicity is I think Eddie and Sophia would probably agree that I don't really interrogate to the extent that in the sense that interrogate means, really using class and ethnicity as a kind of unit of analysis and as a framework of analysis. There's almost nothing about ethnicity, as I acknowledge in the introduction. It was not that, Sophia's right, it was not that easy to find women, and the women that I did find who were actually writing letters and speaking and whose actions I knew were elite women. I know that there were non-elite women who belonged to these cofradias. First of all, cofradias had always had a mix of classes and ethnicities since the colonial period. That was standard in a standard operation. I mean, I think the ones that were more exclusive are actually exceptions to the rule. So it doesn't surprise me that there were a lot of women who were non-elite women in these associations, but I just don't know too much about them because I know in some cases their names, and that's it. So I didn't feel that I could do as much with class and ethnicity using the sources that I used as I would have liked to. I mean, basically, this is a story of it is a story of urban cofradias. So there are indigenous women who lived in cities, but these are not indigenous cofradias. So yeah, no, I wouldn't say those are major frameworks. I see where you're going with this question, and it's a super interesting question, and I lecture about it in my classes on Mexican history at great length, but the book isn't going to help you much on that. I hope you read it for different reasons, but it's not gonna help.
Oh, I'm absolutely going to read it, but I appreciate your honest feedback, and I may actually get in touch with you about some of the sources that you do use in your lectures regarding that, because it is something that has been really difficult for me to get resources for,
Sure.
Just especially in the 19th century, of some of the differences in visibility and roles of and when I say indigenous women, really I'm talking about ethnically indigenous women, not necessarily indigenous women that live outside of urban society, but those that would be perceived as darker skin, people in impoverished communities. And their religiosity really had a kind of a different the church really played a huge role in the way that they had a sense of self, especially post conversion to Christianity in so many of these communities, and really saw themselves as protectors of that culture. And so I was just super curious to see if that was included in your book, but hopefully this inspires other people as well to kind of build on Margaret's work as well, which is always wonderful.
Yeah, no, that sounds super interesting. And I would have loved to have been able to do more with it. And I guess I'll tell you what sources to avoid.
Excellent. Okay, but I still very much look forward to reading your work.
Thank you. Thanks.
Sophie, were you going to add anything? ¿Ibas a decir algo, Sophie?
Sí, justo pensé que podría ayudar un poquito a Margaret con el uso de las fuentes. Me parece que la propia construcción de las fuentes de las organizaciones católicas, que por lo menos yo he revisado para el periodo que Teresita estaba interesada, no hay una discusión tajante en torno a la etnicidad, en torno a hacer diferencias en cuanto a la etnicidad, ¿no? La diferencia que se hace es en torno a la clase. Las dirigentes serán como las personajes de clases altas principalmente, y incluso así las señalan, ¿no? Como las señoras mexicanas, que recibirán el apoyo de otro grupo de mujeres, generalmente mujeres de clases bajas, ¿no? Y esto tiene mucho que ver con las zonas en donde ellas realizan sus actividades, ¿no? Por lo menos hacia el periodo de la Revolución. Entonces a mí no me sorprende que Margaret no haya encontrado estas diferencias, porque yo creo que tiene mucho que ver con la forma en la que se construye la idea del Estado mexicano, y por tanto también este paralelismo que hace la Iglesia todo el tiempo de ir como midiendo su relación con la construcción del liberalismo mexicano. Entonces creo que conforme el liberalismo mexicano no vaya construyendo una idea del mestizaje, la Iglesia tampoco la hará. Creo que se preocuparán por este tema ya entrado a la posrevolución, cuando Gabino Barreda, ese ya estaría muerto. ¿Cómo se llama? Gamio, Manuel Gamio, Vasconcelos y demás, empiezan ya a hablar de la importancia de la construcción de un mexicano mestizo, ¿no? Pero creo que antes las fuentes nos limitan un poco para trabajar la idea de la raza, sobre todo en términos del género, como lo han trabajado en Estados Unidos. Por lo menos en el tipo de fuentes que yo he utilizado, ¿no?
I will put in a plug for correspondence as a source that you just never know what nugget, what great thing you might find. I think some of my favorite anecdotes came from letters, and it's a low yield kind of work. A lot of letters just don't give you very much, and they're not form letters, so you have to actually read every word. The Archiepiscopal Archive in Jalisco has not been reorganized. At least it hadn't. I don't think it has been. Maybe some of you have been there more recently than I, but the last time I was there, it was still organized by parish. And a lot of the material in each of those boxes of stuff on parishes was correspondence. Eddie, you've been there more recently than I have.
Well, I was going to make a comment, Teresita, on your question. One thing that I did find very useful was in Oaxaca, the Archbishop wrote a pastoral visit diary.
Yeah.
And in that, he actually makes recommendations like recomendamos erguir esta asociación para los de razón y para los indígenas. So he is actually making recommendations in his auto for some of these towns, especially indigenous communities or communities that have mestizos or hispanos and indígenas, for this is the association for los de razón, and this is the association for. So he does that kind of thing. What I don't think many of his associations pegan, that are for indigenous ideal. I think you do see, if you look at some of these associations, how shall I say, their materials, you can pretty easily detect some that are aimed at class groups, ones that are designed to be simpler, to be like, and these are kind of the ones that don't, I think Margaret even mentions this in the book, the Sagrada Familia was aimed lower down the class scale and doesn't really take off. But I think it's, when you look at its materials that they're putting out there, they're aiming at a quote lower class or working class group. So you can pick up some of that there, and then you can pick up in the sometimes like in an auto, like I said. The tragedy about that Oaxacan source is it has since disappeared since I used it. Nobody seems to know where 12 volumes of a handwritten diary is.
Wow.
It was in a
Wow.
it was in a private collection of Luis Castañeda Guzman, who has now passed away, and we don't know what happened to. Yo tengo mis sospechas. ¿Quién se lo clavó? But so those kinds of things are out there. I want to second Margaret's idea about correspondence. I find correspondence the most exciting, and it's weird, right? And my trick is like anything that's longer than 7 pages, read it. Because that means somebody's mad about something.
Yeah. So just to build on this and then turn over to Natalie, because she's had her hand up for a little while. Building on Sophie's points and what these folks are saying, Teresita, like I work on the 1920s and 30s, and I see race everywhere in these Catholic women's groups. And you'll have to come to my book talk in about 6 years when I talk about this, because that's exactly what I'm writing on. Las Damas Católicas were very much concerned about indigenous women, and they're not saying this, as Sophie is saying, with like sutilezas. Like they're being very direct about el indígena and moralización and campesinas and this and that. So it's but to second the point, I mean, the 20s and 30s is a very different time, right? I mean, the language of race is now globally like taking off, right? And there are folks here who have studied eugenics, like Sophie and others. So I think for the 19th century, I can see why there's so many challenges. And then now, given what Eddie is mentioning about sources disappearing, I mean, I'm just glad that I have a Dropbox account and I could just put everything in there, all the images and such. But as far as the period that you asked about with the post-revolutionary period, I've certainly seen a lot, and I have even just like some of these magazines and the imagery that they're using and the discourses. There are times where it's explicitly racial and class, and there are times where it's more implicit and there's innuendos, right? And Ben Falah, who was here, who just left recently, when I was telling him a little bit about my archival trip, he was so helpful because he made the really good point that says, Mexicans are rarely going to talk about race in these very overt ways, like, US Americans, or maybe some folks in certain regions of South America. You have to look also at innuendos, at double meanings in the languages. And I think there are certainly many ways in which the language of morality and moralizing discourses get used to promote racial agendas, right? So we can talk about that more. But again, this is the period that I study is the epilogue, the end of the epilogue of Margaret's book, right? So this is very different, and certainly not the conversation that I'm engaging in the longue durée. But anyway, I want to thank you all, and I want to just ask Natalie, if you want to just please share your question. Thank you for being so patient and listening to us all talk, but I know that you have a lot of great things to say, and thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you, Professor Chowining, for your book as well. It's nice to see familiar faces and new faces on this chat. Yeah, so I feel bad. I'll be steering us away a little bit from this conversation, which I found very interesting, but I actually did want to turn to your epilogue, and I wanted to ask, like, because I have yet to read the book, so I wanted to know more as the book ends in the 20th century, what you're seeing happen. And I also wanted to invite you to maybe think, because at least it seems like the title suggests that the book ends in 1940. I also wanted to invite you that if you had to imagine, what do you think changes for the rest of the 20th century? But yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, well, I will say that the early drafts of that epilogue did not go past 1940, and both of my external readers, I think both of them, and definitely my editor at Princeton, thought that I should say something. And, there's past 1940, there's, at least I didn't turn up very much secondary material that I could mine for ideas about how to bring this story to the present. So I used a little bit of anthropology, a few anthropologists who have discovered signs that the ACM groups are not dead. I mean, that's sort of the conventional narrative is the ACM is totally dominated by women. After 1950, it just declines in numbers rapidly. The implication is that it was because it was so dominated by women, it just became irrelevant to regular Catholics and embarrassing to the hierarchy. Although I don't think anybody actually says that explicitly. And so I guess the semi-solution that I found was to say, look, there are these anthropologists who find maybe these are ACM groups that are not, that it may be that the central organization is not as attentive to gathering statistics. So if you study the central records, you're not going to see what you did in the 30s or 40s, maybe. But that maybe they're out there. So that was one thing. And then I borrowed from, well, I mean, these are my ideas too, but Christina Boylan's important dissertation from the year 2000 that is about the women's groups within the ACM, but has actually a long section in which she talks about other parish groups that are also important. And since my book was about parish importance, I kind of took what she had done when she was probably asked to look into the future and my own projections into the future and said maybe that, so it wasn't a conclusion, but maybe a sort of call for more research on non-ACM groups, that it's not, that there's a long history in Mexico of cofradias kind of rising and falling. And one of them is super popular for a long time. This happened in the colonial period too. And then it would become sort of old hat and people would drift towards a new, more exciting devotion or more exciting cofradia. So that kind of thing has always happened. And I think maybe to judge the degree of devotion to the church by men or women on the basis of membership in the ACM is that's not enough, that we ought to be doing more. This brings back sort of to and I know we're almost out of time, but back to Eddie's point about his mother and his grandmother, who have there are a lot more associations and opportunities available to women. I mean, these 19th century women, one of my sort of sub arguments is that there were so many and such vibrant Catholic associations that they kind of sucked the oxygen out of the room for other associations to thrive, so that while men's associations that were not Catholic associations were pretty vibrant in the 19th century, women's weren't. But towards the toward the beginning of the 20th century, we do start to see the training in normal schools, the adherence to some kind of version of anti-clericalism, whether it was mild or extreme, take hold, and you start to see more opportunities for women that are not within Catholic associations. I forget why I started talking about that, but that's sort of back to Eddie's point that his grandmother and his mother are still. Did you say that they're still paying attention to? They're still in schools. They're still teaching. You didn't say they were still trying to teach doctrine.
No, they aren't. So I would say these people were, deeply rooted in the Catholic educational tradition, but yet ended up teaching in Mexican public environments.
Yeah.
But doing so as Catholics.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So by the time you get to the 50s, when my mother was a young teacher, she was teaching in public schools, but seeing it as her Catholic mission, if you will. And, and still, openly expressing her Catholicism to students, that without any compunction. And so that's where, and this is where I think you kind of hint at this in that epilogue.
Yeah,
there's
a lot of this. I found a lot of those people too. And
right, this opening or this, sort of movement into broader circles. And yet at a time culturally when you could be more publicly Catholic in secular institutions.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. Thank you all. I don't know if there are any lingering questions or if we can, I'm still on the cliffhanger of why these women didn't sign their names on the petitions. I've been hanging on to that for like 45 minutes now, meaning to ask you about it. I don't know if there's a quick answer to that.
There's several, I offer several explanations, but the simplest one, the one that we can finish in the time we have available, is that I think there was the experience in 1856 in particular in that petition campaign showed women that they needed to have numbers and they needed to sign their names, because there was a lot of discounting the women's petitions as having been written by priests and not really signed by women, not having anything to do with women. So I think there was this sort of mania to collect signatures and then print every single one of them. And so you wanted more numbers than just the number of people in your association. So if you signed as an association, it would be the membership of that association. And I think the perception was that it could be marginalized. Whereas if you signed as individuals, we are talking about the 19th century after all. If you signed as individuals, then there's more power.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I have some follow-up things, but we can certainly email about this, because I noticed some really interesting, even in the 1930s, rarely do you see folks like signing their name when they're writing or publishing things. And I wonder how much of that could be traced to the 19th century. And so I'm just really curious about that dynamic, but that's for another time and place. I really appreciate what we've I really appreciate what we've gone with this conversation. It's been fantastic. And I just want to say thanks again, first and foremost, to you, Margaret, for sharing this amazing work with us, guiding us through the process. Some of us have started reading the book and we'll hopefully, be able to finish it soon. And then also thank you to our comentaristas, Eddie and Sophia, for those really insightful comments and questions. Both of the three of you, right? Just experts in your fields, and really a fantastic conversation all around. And those of you who attended and asked questions or shared comments, thank you for coming. I know that there'll be many more who weren't able to make it today, but we'll probably see this on YouTube. So again, if you have any questions for us, feel free to email us at hiscatmex@gmail.com. We're signing off now, but just wanted to say thank you to everybody for making this really special. Thanks.
Bye.
Adiós.
Adiós.